If you've been Murano shopping over the last few years and you dismissed Nissan's mid-size two-row crossover because it didn't handle that well and it had a CVT under the hood and maybe the interior wasn't nice enough for you, you might want to check out the new 2025 version because it's been completely redesigned and it addresses pretty much all of those complaints, putting this back in contention to be perhaps an alternative to a Lexus RX. Not a true competitor, I would say, but certainly a solid value alternative. Let's take a look at what's new. When it comes to design, Nissan has recently decided to shake things up. They are no longer doing a Russian nesting doll lineup where everything they make is a scale version of one another. You'll notice no V-motion grille, no chrome U-shapes or anything like that going on in the front end of the Murano. Instead, I see a little bit of the new kicks and a little bit of Nissan Ariya blended into this design. We have relatively slim LED headlights, and those headlights are nice and high exactly where they belong. They're not located somewhere weird down lower on the bumper. We have these DRLs here. The stripes match the grille stripes, and then of course we have the LED turn signal tucked neatly just above those stripes. No fog lights down below. I am kind of surprised by that, but we do have a big radar sensor in the middle. That is standard because adaptive cruise control is standard. The new white Nissan logo there, and then of course a 360-degree camera in the middle. The big thing you'll notice though is the width. This has grown significantly versus the previous Murano, and all of that goes to the interior, where we certainly find wider seats and greater distance between the outboard seats, front and back. The Murano may be wider and longer than before, but it hasn't lost sight of its original mission to be an alternative to a boxy SUV. And the profile, as you can see, is pretty similar to the Muranos that have come before. At 192.9 inches long, this is almost exactly the same length as the Lexus RX, but this is a little bit more upright in terms of its general design than we find in that Lexus. The latest Lexus RX gives me more wagon vibes than we find in this model. Now, speaking of wagons, this is also a direct competitor to the Subaru Outback, of course the Toyota Crown Signia. It's probably a bit closer of a competitor to those models than the Lexus RX, to be perfectly honest. I would call this an alternative to, not a direct competitor to, the Lexus RX. But you could also cross-shop something like a Chevy Blazer. It's right about the same size as this, also the Atlas Cross Sport and the Honda Passport, but those two vehicles are significantly taller in terms of their roofline and much, much boxier. So if you're looking for something that is sleeker, sexier, more organic in terms of its design, you want to go in this direction. If you're looking for that boxy, practical cargo area, you will find that in the Passport. Although the cargo hatchback here, it's pretty big, as you're going to see in a moment. Nissan really wanted to accentuate the width of the Murano, and that's why they tuck in the greenhouse just a little bit towards the rear, giving us this very distinctive haunch in the back. They're also an interesting combination of sharp lines across the side and some of these more organic curves as well. Adding to the sort of premium feel that we get versus some of the smaller competition, we have full LED taillights in the rear with amber turn signals and kind of a cool vertical hash theme running all the way across there for those taillights. This one is the all-wheel drive model, and it is the fully loaded Platinum version, as you can see right over there. So as we look around, keep in mind you will see things here that you don't find in the base model, but all Muranos are actually relatively well equipped, and there is a relatively narrow pricing gap from the bottom to the top. It's only around $10,000 or so from that base model to the fully loaded trim. This model has the two-tone paint scheme, so you'll see we have a black roof up there, we have black accents down here, and then a gray lower finisher on the bumper. Nissan moved the license plate all the way to the bottom of the bumper, but thankfully they didn't put the release down here where it's likely to get dirtier. Instead, they put it right there inside the Nissan logo. It's taken Nissan a while, but they have finally admitted that Murano shoppers were not the biggest fans of the continuously variable automatic transmission. So in its place, we now have a 9-speed automatic transmission made by ZF of Germany. This is basically the same 9-speed auto that we have seen in a number of Honda and Acura and Chrysler and even some Land Rover products as well. It's over here on this side of the engine bay. On that side, we also find a new engine, but it's not a V6. That is something that the Murano has been known for quite some time. That is now gone as well. In its place, we find the variable compression turbo engine from other Nissan products, producing 241 horsepower, 260 pound-feet of torque. That is less power than we find in the Lexus RX. That gives you 275 horsepower, but it is more than we find in the Blazer, and certainly more than we find in the base engine in the Subaru Outback at just 182 horsepower. Torque is pretty reasonable at 260 pound-feet, and you will get 23 miles per gallon whether you choose all-wheel drive or front-wheel drive. That's also kind of a surprise that there is no difference in city, highway, or the combined score for choosing the $1,000 all-wheel drive option box. Let's dive into the interior, starting with the driver's seat. If you get the top trims, you get the panoramic moonroof standard, and that is going to cut down on headroom, but I think it's actually still pretty generous, even given the more flowing style that we find in this model versus the boxy and upright style we find in some. And that's because the driver's seat goes pretty low. So if you want that more station wagon sedan-like seating position, you can do that, but it also goes up quite high to definitely give you more of an SUV-like driving position, assuming you will still fit, of course, under the ceiling. We also have an available powered tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion, memory linked, of course, to the 2-position memory over there on the driver's door. We have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support on the driver's side. Top trims are going to add that to the passenger seat as well. And then we get Nissan's massage functionality, which I think is actually a bit of a surprise. And it's a little bit better of a massage than we find in some, but not as aggressive as you find in the luxury segment in some European options. Thanks to the size of the Murano, we definitely find more room in the back seats than the average compact crossover like a CR-V or RAV4. Solidly one reason to get this over that. I have about 7 inches of legroom between the front seats and my knees there, and we have basically a flat floor in the back, which makes it a lot easier to put 5 people back here, or if you're trying to put child seats in the back and they have the anti-rebound leg that needs to go on the floor, it's going to be a lot easier to put those seats in the middle of the seat back. And speaking of child seats, let's measure this out. 11 inches up from the seat bottom. We get 31 inches here in this critical dimension for especially rear-facing child seats. That means you get significantly more room yet again than RAV4 or CR-V. And a wider bench in the back, another big reason to get this over that. 2 big cup holders here in this armrest, and the shoulder belt comes out of the seat back itself. We have these little removable doors for the lower latch anchors. These are my least favorite because everybody knows you're going to lose these. Despite the curvaceous design, we have a solid amount of cargo space behind the power hatch. Again, the button's right there in the Nissan logo. You'll get 32.9 cubic feet behind the second row, 63.5 cubic feet behind the first row, if you can have those rear seats folded. That's above the Lexus RX and above the Chevy Blazer as well. For some reason, the Blazer visually looks bigger than this, but in reality, it's about the same size, and on the inside, we actually get more usable room in the Murano. Of course, if you want a bigger and squarer cargo area, you can check out the new Honda Passport. That is definitely going to give you a very vertical hatch and a very square cargo area back here. But Nissan doesn't skimp on things to give us this cargo capacity. Under the load floor, we actually find a spare tire, something that is disappearing in so many vehicles out there, but thankfully Nissan is still giving us one. Now, it's not a full-size spare tire, but they do maximize cargo capacity by giving us the subwoofer in the middle of that. There's a little bit of storage space on either side. Unfortunately, Nissan did not have any base Muranos for us to look at, but the interior is going to be very similar to this because the 2-screen setup in the dashboard is standard, as is imitation leather upholstery. But we're in the Platinum trim, so let's look around this model. Up here we have the controls for the optional moonroof, also a sunglass holder right there. We also have slide to the side sun visors. If I could pull that off, you can see they do slide relatively far. Vanity mirrors on both sides. I probably would get the panoramic moonroof because I like the airy feeling to the interior, but if you're looking for more headroom, you want to skip it because it does cut things down by more than an inch in the first row and in the second row. This model has the integrated sunshades back there on the rear doors, kind of a nice touch, and the upgraded ambient lighting. There are several different two-tone interiors if you choose the Platinum trim. This has sort of a, I guess you'd say chestnut brown, medium chestnut, and ivory setup here. If you are looking for more of a modern color combo, I guess you could say, there's also a blue interior. Hopefully I'll be able to show you those interior color cards a little bit later. On the doors, we have lots of soft touch materials, soft touch upper stitched section, really soft armrests, something Nissan has been known for a while, and then harder plastics, of course, down there around the bottle holder in the door. Moving over to the dashboard, again, you'll notice that the design is very similar to the Nissan Ariya with different finishes. So up here, we find a soft touch injection molded dashboard component, stitched midsection. Nissan says that this portion here is supposed to sort of mimic Murano glass. Don't worry, it is not actually glass, it is a plastic trim panel, and it does have kind of a gentle fade in color from one side to the other. We then have imitation wood trim here, very similar to what we see in the Nissan Ariya, although I think the Ariya's imitation wood trim is done just a little bit better. Here we have a bin-style glove compartment. I was barely able to squeeze an 11-inch tablet computer inside. Let's check out the MSRP on this one. This one is $51,415 as equipped right here. The seats themselves, the seat bottom cushion is a little on the flat side for me personally, but I think that the length is just fine. These are also Nissan's zero gravity seats, so they're pretty darn comfortable. We have pretty moderate bolstering on the side there, so larger folks shouldn't have a problem at all. And as I said before, the passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat, including the four-way lumbar. Moving back over to the dashboard here, we have the first of the two 12.3-inch LCDs. This is running Nissan's latest software, but you should know that the full Google integration is not standard. You get the screen and you get very similar software in the base model, but you don't get all of the Google add-on bits. This software is pretty similar to what we see in the new Armada as well. Moving down from there, we have physical volume controls, track forward, backward toggle over there, kind of like we see in the Ariya, and then touch buttons integrated into the imitation wood panel in the dashboard. Let me know what you think about this look. I think it's relatively well done, although again, I think the imitation wood in the Ariya is done a little bit better. We have two USB-C charge ports there that also interface with the system. I currently have my phone connected via wired CarPlay, although the system supports wireless as well. We have push button shifters here, again, similar to what we find in the Armada. D mode for the drive mode, not Depeche mode. Auto start, stop, enable, disable, a button for the 360-degree surround camera system. But unlike the new Armada, you can't expand these camera views out to the other screen. So they're always going to be just on that central screen right there. We have a small storage cubby next to that area, two big cup holders there, and a decently sized storage compartment under that center armrest. You can see you got a water bottle in there and a whole ton of other stuff, but no additional USB-C ports inside. On the driver's side of the dash, we have a full color head-up display there, and you can see the combination of colors and materials on the dashboard. I like the fact that Nissan decided to give this a little bit of a binnacle design rather than simply perching the twin screens on the dashboard like tablet computers attached to the dash. Over here, we have another 12.3-inch LCD. We have dimmer controls for the system over there on that side, and everything is controlled via these buttons on the steering wheel I will show you in just a bit. The general design of the instrument cluster software is pretty similar to other Nissan vehicles where you can choose between more of a digital view or the dial gauge view right there. And again, that's all controlled via the controls over here on the steering wheel. But this is a little bit unusual. They've angled this little rotary dial to make it work with your thumb a little bit better, but they did not do the same thing to this side, and for some reason my OCD is a little bit thrown off by that. These are combination physical and touch controls. So we have touch buttons on the surface, and then the entire button module moves, and the system knows what you're selecting based on where your finger is on there. You'll find track forward, backward over there, volume up, down over here, and the Pro Pilot system, which is what Nissan calls their adaptive cruise control and lane centering software. It's worth noting that we don't have a driver monitoring system here because we also don't have Pro Pilot 2.1, which is Nissan's hands-off-the-wheel system. The steering wheel itself, it's a two-spoke design with pretty aggressive sport grips up top for a vehicle in this class, paddle shifters on the back, and I do like the really thick rim. It's nice and softly padded as well. To the left of the steering wheel, we find an additional button bank, and that's where you're going to find the button to engage and disengage the auto brake hold. The turbo and the traditional automatic certainly give the new Murano a different character out on the road. They also give it better performance. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 6.8 seconds, which is surprisingly about the exact same time as an all-wheel drive version of a Lexus RX. Even though the RX has a bit more power, doesn't necessarily make it that much quicker. And I think that's because this 9-speed automatic has some really aggressive starting ratios. That's thanks to the really broad ratio spread, so they can give you a really high final gear to give you good fuel economy out on the highway and a really aggressive starting ratio to give you better acceleration. This is a good road surface to talk about the way that power is delivered, because there is something you should know. If I floor this from a standstill, we get pretty decent grip thanks to the all-wheel drive system, but at around 30 miles an hour, this system stops sending as much power to the rear axle. And by the time you hit about 40 to 45 miles an hour, only a smidgen of the power is going to the rear. And that means we do get a lot more torque steer than the competition, especially at higher speeds. Even speeds around 30 miles an hour here, you will definitely notice a lot of tugging on the steering wheel. You'll also notice that in straight line acceleration, the steering wheel is definitely tugging around a bit, and that is somewhat surprising and somewhat counter to the more sporty mission that we find in this generation of the Murano, because acceleration is definitely solid, and the regular automatic transmission has a really great feel to it. We should talk a little bit about that detail, however, also. There are going to be shifts due to the design of this transmission that don't feel quite as normal as some, say the 9-speed automatic that we find in Chevy's Blazer. And that's just due to the design of this transmission. So if I'm driving this transmission out here, especially if I'm in the eco mode where it's going to be very aggressive at upshifting, and then I want to pass someone, floor it, you wait for it, then the shift happens, then you start accelerating. And it's going to be a bit more noticeable going downhill using the paddle shifters. Now, I think this is something that's relatively easy to get used to, and it's definitely more engaging than any of the CVTs that have come before it. In our preliminary braking tests, it took 118 feet for this to stop from highway speeds. That's a pretty solid score, especially considering the temperature outside. Right now it's 48 degrees, but it was 34 degrees this morning, so things are definitely cold outside. When it comes to the handling score, I'm going to have to give this a B+, because even though we get lots of grip, neutral handling is definitely good if we go around these corners. Has a nice level feel to it. There's not a lot of tip, not a lot of dive, reasonable amount of grip, again, thanks to those wide tires. But the all-wheel drive system does let this down just a little bit. And I have to say, I'm just a teensy-weensy bit disappointed by that. I would have hoped that Nissan would have actually gone the opposite direction and maybe given this a slightly more aggressive all-wheel drive system, because that would fit with the sportier character. Of course, if you're getting the front-wheel drive model, there's no difference between this and the competition. But if you are cross-shopping something like the Lexus RX, it's going to send more power to the rear axle across a broader variety of different speeds. And of course, if you're looking at something like a Honda Passport or even something like an Acura RDX, which I don't think is the craziest cross, those will certainly send more power to the rear, and they have torque vectoring capability to send power across the rear axle. So they're certainly going to feel more dynamic when the road starts to wind. On the other hand, the ride quality is fantastic. I give this an A+. Even though they have certainly firmed things up and this doesn't feel like a wet noodle out on the road, it has a solid, decent, big SUV feel. Even though Nissan has firmed up the suspension in this generation, they didn't make it rock hard. Previous generations were accused of being a little marshmallowy, a little too floaty-boaty. That does not apply to this Murano. Things are certainly better controlled, especially with the rear suspension. Cabin noise is also well controlled. I don't have any official numbers, but just to rev this up again from a slower speed, you'll certainly notice that even though we get engine noise in the cabin, I think this is actually more pleasing than the engine sounds that we find from Lexus's 2.4-liter turbo. That engine is particularly gruff. Now, on the downside, fuel economy could be a little bit better. After a day of mixed driving, we've been averaging 21.5 mpg. I would love to see a slightly higher fuel economy score. Keep in mind, of course, the price tag of the Murano is relatively low, and certainly lower than a lot of the hybrid competition. But you could get something like a Crown Signia with its hybrid system, and that is going to be a decent amount more efficient. It's not really the same thing. It's more of a wagon, to be honest, more of an Outback, a luxury Outback competitor, but it is going to be more efficient than the Murano. I think Nissan did exactly what they needed to do with the new Murano. This is no longer your grandfather's bubbly floaty boat, but neither exactly is it a corner carving machine, and you will really notice that on these roads. That's all down to the all-wheel drive system that I mentioned before. But it's worth noting that not all of the competition has a super aggressive all-wheel drive system like we find in the Passport or some of those Acuras. In truth, this is not really that much different than something like the all-wheel drive system in the Buick Envision, although the Envision seems to have a little bit less torque steer. Also with less torque steer would be the Subaru Outback Turbo, because it's going to be more aggressive at sending power to the rear. But I don't think that's a huge problem for most shoppers out there. I'm not too concerned also about highway snow traction, because really the time you're going to want all-wheel drive the most is when you're at lower speeds and you're starting off. We do have to wait and see how this works at higher speeds, of course, because it still has a traction control system and it's still going to recognize wheel slip and try and send power to the other axle. But how well that works at speeds over maybe 50 miles an hour or so, that does remain to be seen. Are you ready for some bad news? Well, you probably guessed this already. The new Murano is more expensive than the old Murano. This one's going to start at $41,860 for the base front-wheel drive model, which is about a $1,700 jump over the last generation Murano. And as tested with this cool two-tone teal paint job, it came in at $51,415. That is also more expensive than the most expensive version last year. However, it is actually quite a bit less expensive than something like that Lexus RX, which intrinsically is not that much different than the model that we see here. Now, there are a few things to know about the Murano lineup. Only the base version is going to start as a front-wheel drive model. All-wheel drive is going to be standard on every other version, and if you want to add all-wheel drive to the base version, it's only a $1,000 bump, so I'd probably go ahead and do that, especially since it doesn't affect the fuel economy averages. However, if you want features like the panoramic roof, the Bose audio system, 360-degree camera, the integrated Google Assistant system, ambient lighting, and the heated steering wheel, you have to jump up to the SL trim. And that's a pretty healthy jump up to $47,950. Keep in mind, in addition to all that equipment, it also adds all-wheel drive standard. So that accounts for a decent portion of that difference. The Platinum trim, it's a smaller jump, and I suspect if you're going to go all the way up to SL, you might as well just land into the Platinum trim as well, because this is going to be the one with the actual leather seats. You also get the window shades in the back. The power memory linked steering column is only going to be available in the Platinum trim, front seat massage, and of course, four-way passenger lumbar support as well. The Platinum trim, it's a pretty decent alternative to a base Lexus RX, and we should probably get into that a bit now. On the inside of the RX, you will find finishes that are a bit more premium here and there. You will find more power, and you'll find available hybrid systems with significantly more power also. But all of that is going to cost you quite a bit, because including destination, the RX starts at $50,325. That means every Murano, except for a completely loaded Murano, is going to be less expensive than any Lexus RX out on the road. There's no hybrid system under this hood. That is the one thing I would love to see in a future Murano, would be a new Nissan hybrid system that could give us maybe 30 mpg. But bear in mind that the Lexus RX 350, which is not a hybrid, actually has pretty similar fuel economy to this, and it's the best seller at the moment in the Lexus RX lineup. Obviously, the badge is definitely part of the price difference. You're going to be paying more for the Lexus dealer experience, Lexus legendary reliability, and the Lexus logo on the hood and on the seat backs. But intrinsically, they're pretty similar vehicles. As far as handling, performance, etc., those are very, very similar between the two vehicles. 0 to 60 time is a little bit quicker in the Lexus RX, but it's still no slouch here in this model, thanks to the really wide ratio spread we find in that 9-speed automatic transmission. Now, the 9-speed automatic, that is probably the most controversial part of the Murano. Not quite as controversial as the CVT that came before it, but this 9-speed is not known for having the smoothest shifts out there, and that's just due to the intrinsic design of ZF's 9-speed auto. There are certain shifts as you work your way from gear 1 up to gear 9 and 9 all the way back down to 1 that are just not going to be as smooth as the other shifts, and that's simply the way this transmission was designed. And we see the exact same thing in the Honda, Acura, Chrysler, Jeep, Land Rover, etc., etc., etc. models worldwide that use the same 9-speed auto. The benefit, though, is that fuel economy is decent, especially at higher speeds, because 9th gear is really, really high, and that seriously improves high-speed fuel efficiency. Then there's the reality that it's also a lot less expensive than a decent number of the competitors. Whether you want to call a Grand Cherokee perhaps a sideways competitor, or you're looking simply at the mainline options, if you don't need a third row in the back of your Highlander, you might want to take a look at something like this. If you're looking for something less expensive than the RX, something a bit more premium, more comfortable, and I think more stylish than a Chevy Blazer, you might want to check out one of these as well. The only downside left that we need to mention as well is that there's no extra power available. No V6, no higher output 2-liter turbo, and I am a little bit disappointed in that. We all know that the 9-speed auto can handle more power because there are more powerful engines in competitors that use the 9-speed, but Nissan chose not to give us extra oomph. But Nissan did give us the most attractive Murano ever designed, and I think one of the sharpest looking entries in this segment. On the downside, no hybrid system means that some shoppers are simply not going to be interested, although I would remind them that the most attractive part of the Murano is probably going to be its price tag. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and let me know, did Nissan do enough with this Murano? And if they didn't, what would make the Murano perfect for you? Let me know all that down there, and we'll see you next week.